Bruchim Aboim B'Shem Hashem. B'Shem Ergin Shir Torah, Moses Boston. I'd like to welcome everyone to tonight's shir. I'd like to welcome everyone who was matriach to come in person, the men, and the shul, and the women in Desert Noshim, and all the multitudes who are joining us through the phone system and the streaming. I'd like to give a big yasher koyach to Elam B'Shem for the exclusive sponsorship of tonight's shir. Cover the Shloishim, Lili Nishmas, Rabbi Yeshua, Rabbi Paysach Krohn, sponsored by his daughter. To have this great schus of sponsoring a shir of the Liman HaTorah B'Rabim, call Irgin Shir Torah at 718-851-8651 or email ist@yeshivanet.com. Tonight we have the cover to have with us once again, noted Maggid, Rabbi Paysach Krohn shlita, speak about the loss of the Gadol Ador of Chaim Kanievsky Zatzal. My cover to call in Rabbi Krohn for tonight's drasha.
Oh, wow. Okay. I'd like to take this opportunity to thank my dear friends, Rabbi Elazar Bald and Rabbi Simcha Deutsch, for having invited me once again to come to speak to all of you here in the Boston and Beis Medrash for Irgun Shirei Torah. We've gone through a very, very difficult period of 2.5 years. Tremendous tsaras and pain. It started with COVID. I hope that nobody suffered death in their families, but we all know great tzaddikim and wonderful people and families that passed away. We know, Rahman al-Islam, so many people were sick, ventilators, respirators, and even today, there's still people that are still affected by that illness. We had the terrible tragedy in Meron. 45 tzaddikim of all ages, of all stripes, never lost their lives. This past Sunday night, I was in Surfside. I spoke at the first yard site. So heartbreaking. 7 shuls got together, over 400 people. You could just feel the pain, and all those rabbanim that spoke about what it was to live through that Gehenna and to lose people that they knew so well from their shuls. It's just absolutely awful. All the Yidden Nebuchadnezzar lost their lives in such a sudden, terrible way. We know, Rahman al-Islam, so many Ukrainian Yidden have had to run. Imagine you had to leave Flatbush overnight, just take a suitcase and just go to another country where you don't know anybody and you don't know the language. Just so terrible. And then, of course, the loss of the Gadol Ador, the greatest Masmid in our generation, the greatest Yadin of Torah in our generation, the one who really protected all of us with his Torah. And so how do we go through this? How do we live through it? And I once saw a beautiful expression. I was at a Shabbaton where a whole group of people, Rahman al-Islam, had suffered the same type of tragedy. I don't want to say what it was, it's not important, but they gave everybody a brochure. And on the cover of the brochure was such a brilliant statement. And it said like this: don't just go through it, grow through it. And that's such a great lesson in life. We all go through difficulties in life. Don't just go through it, but grow through it. And that's what a person has to do. When Rahman al-Islam would go through a difficult time, certainly like the tsaras that we mentioned, we can't just go through it. You have to think about. We'll never know until Mashiach comes why the Rabbi Shalom does these things, as only Rav Malach Biederman could have said after he said by Meron, he said something so brilliant. We know the Mishnah in Avos. It says, "Dam malamayla mimcha." You should know what's on top of you. There's ayin roya, oizen shamas, and chol masecha b'sefer nechtovim. So he said something brilliant. Da, you should know. Ma, the 45 who are lost lamayla mimcha. It's beyond us. We'll never understand it. And that's the same thing with all the tsaras, the Ukrainian Jews, Surfside, COVID. Only when Mashiach comes will we know why these things happen. But certainly we have to grow from it. We have to live through it. And we have to continue on. We have to try to figure out what does the Rebbeinu Shalom want from us and how do we grow. And so I want to share with you something very interesting as we talk about Rab Chaim Zecher Tzadik V'Kodesh Levracha. Rabbi Yitzchak Elchanan, the Kovner Rav, Rabbi Yitzchak Elchanan Spector once said something that is so beautiful and can be a guidepost for every single one of us for the rest of our lives. And he said, what is the ideal Yid supposed to be? And he said, you could see it in a pasuk in Truma. And the pasuk is in Shemois Chafei pasuk Chaf. And it says like this, V'hoyu hakruvim, the kruvim, the wings that were on top of the Aron Kodesh, Persei Kenofayim Lamaila, the wings spread upward. And then the pasuk says, at the end of the pasuk, U'pneihem ish elochiv. There were faces of two little children. The faces were towards each other. Zogt Rabbi Yitzchak Elchanan, that's what every Yid has to be. Persei Kenofayim Lamaila. When you're davening and when you're learning, it's facing towards HaKadosh Baruch Hu. We're trying to get as close as we can through Torah and Yer Shemayim and Tefillah through Hashem. But as great as you are in learning, and as great as you are in davening, and as great as you are in Yer Shemayim, you can never forget the second part of the pasuk, U'pnei Mishalochiv, and that's the Beinodam L'Chaveroi, and that's what the total Yid is all about. It's Persek Nafayim L'Maila, but it's Pnei Mishalochiv. And the Malbim says something also fascinating at the beginning of Truma, and he says every single one of us, every single person, is supposed to be a walking, talking Beis Hamikdash. And if you would think about how he says this and how we conduct ourselves, we'll see really on what kind of high ramah we can be and we should be. And he says like this, Ha'arain, your brain, your seichel is like the Aron Kodesh. The Aron Kodesh had the luchais in it. Your brain has Torah, the thought process. So your brain, your head is really an Aron Kodesh. Your heart, you can't exist without a heart. You can't exist without bread. So your heart is the lechem aponim. And the mizbeach consumes the karbonis, and your stomach consumes food. So imagine if you would think about it this way, that you're a walking, talking Mishkan, you're a walking, talking Beis Hamikdash. Here's the Arain, here's the lechem aponim, here's the mizbeach. All of a sudden, that's a different type of personality. It's a different type of achrayas. And if we would realize that that's really what we are, we would talk different, we would act different, we would drive different, we would be sensitive in a different way. And that's what I want to show tonight. I want to show not only the learning, and we'll talk, of course, about the learning, because that's exactly what Rav Chaim was all about, but we're going to show the total personality. The Persek and the Fayim Lamaila, and the Pneim Ish El Achiv. Now, shortly after Rab Chaim was nifter, Rav Gamliel Rabinovich said something so amazing. He said that Rab Chaim Brim, one of the tzaddikim of Yerushalayim, once said that he was so happy that for part of his life, and it was only a small part of his life, because he was born in 1922, and the Chavetz Chaim was nifter 11 years later in 1933. So he said about himself, Rab Chaim Brim, at least I was able to live under the same Kippas HaShamayim, under the same dome of heaven that the Chavetz Chaim lived in. Of course, Rab Chaim Brim was in Yerushalayim, the Chavetz Chaim was in Europe, but it was under the same sky. So he said he felt protected. He lived under the same Kippas HaShamayim. Every single one of us that's here tonight and that's listening all over the world, every one of us should know that we were fortunate that we lived under the same dome of heaven, the same Kippas HaShamayim as Rab Chaim. Now, right after the Shiva, a few people called in Queens, and they wanted to have an evening where there would be Divrei Haskara for Rab Chaim. And so I prepared some thoughts, and that morning I knew that I would be speaking about Rab Chaim that evening to a whole group of people in Queens. I've spoken about this many, many times. I'm so makbid, and I think everybody should be makbid to say karbonis in the morning. And of course, I was saying korban tamid. And at the end, when you say the korban tamid, somehow that morning, I said a phrase that I say every single day, but all of a sudden it had a totally different meaning. It never struck me this way as it did that morning. L'chein yirotzim ufanecha Hashem Elokeinu, l'kei aviseinu. You're talking, sheyehisiach sifseiseinu, that the words of my mouth, siach, Ishmayahu Yosef Chaim. That's the name of Rabbi Chaim Kanievsky. You have three names. Sheyehisiach sifseiseinu choshev umukubal umarutza lefanecha. It should be favorable and accepted and worthy in front of you. And that's the tefillah that we begin tonight. When we're going to talk now about the tzaddik that we were able to live under the same kippus hashemayim, that the siach sifseiseinu, the words that we're going to speak about, the divrei siach, Rab Shemayahu Yosef Chaim, should be merutza and be mukubal in front of HaKadosh Baruch Hu. Now, when Rab Aaron Kotler Zeichat Tzadik Levracha was maspid his shver Rabbi Zalman, he said a very interesting pshat in a famous Gemara. The Gemara in Brachas Davav Amid Beis tells us, Agra de Hespeda deluye. The reward for giving a hesped is deluye, is to make people cry. When a person is chas v'shalom at a levaya, he has to, Rashi says, lahorim koil, he has to lift up his voice. B'loshen nehiva agmas nefesh. And the maspid has to raise his voice, sheyivku hashemim, so that those that are there at the hesped will cry. But Rabbi Aaron said in an original pshat, and he said like this, that the word deli doesn't only mean to cry, agra despeda deluye. Deli is a pail that you draw water from. And that's what he said. Agra de hespeda. When somebody comes to give a hesped or to talk about divrei askara, deluye, we have to draw from the life of that person and see what we can learn from it. How can we change and how can we grow? And that's the purpose of tonight, to see how we can change, how we can be elevated, how we can try, and even in a tiny way, to be what Rab Chaim was all about, and to live as he lived his full potential, that we should live our full potential. Now, of course, he was known as the Satora. What does it mean to be the Satora? I don't know if you know his regular schedule. Let me just tell you what he learned every single day. Every day he learned Zoyar, he learned Tilim, he learned Tanakh, Mishnah Brura, Rambam, Tur, Shulchan Aruch, Bavli, Yerushalmi, Tosefta, Medrash, Kisvei Arizal, and Kisvei Ramchal. It takes us almost a whole day just to say this. And he learned every day. This is what he learned. He finished Shas Bavli every year, Shas Yerushalmi every single year. And it's known that he had a Seder that it fit in within 12 months. So in those years that was an Ibiyar, that he used to write a Sefer because he had extra time that year. But this was his daily regiment. It's almost mind-boggling to think that he could do this. Now, how did it happen? Of course, because he had a tremendous Aava Satora. So how do we gain an Aava Satora like that? How can we give to our children an Aava Satora? So I want to tell you something fascinating that meant so much to me, because I did not know this until after he passed away. But I'm going to tell you a very personal story in a moment. Do you know when he was a little boy, 2-3 years old, his father, at night, before he went to sleep, he would sing a song with him. You know what he sang? He sang the names of all the Masechtas. He didn't sing Mary Had a Little Lamb. He didn't put him to bed with nursery rhymes. The Stipler sang a song that he made up of all the names of the Masechtas, and that's how he rocked his little child to sleep. So, of course, if you hear that, you become familiar with all the Masechtas, and you become familiar. This is part of how you're going to sleep. Now, I'm going to tell you a personal story. I have a son, Eliezer, Zolzang Gesund. He lives in Passaic today. And when he was in the 5th grade in Yeshiva Tveres Moshe, he had a square chassid as his Rebbe, Rav Chana Schweitzman. So I remember it was before Sukkot. He had just started this man, in September, October, right before Sukkot. And he comes home, he's 5th grade. And he says, my Rebbe said we got to know Shas after Sukkot. I said, what do you mean you got to know Shas? He said, how am I going to learn Shas? I said, what did the Rebbe mean? He said, the Rebbe said that we got to know all the Masechtas. How am I going to know all the Masechtas? It's impossible. I said, Eliezer, it's simple. He said, what do you mean it's simple? I said, look, I'm going to make up a song for you. Now, I had no idea this Stipler did this. I said, I'm going to make up a song, and you'll see in a week. You know the tune. I'm going to use the tune that you know, and you'll see. You'll be able to learn it. He said, really? I said, yeah, watch. So I took a list. I made a list of all the Masechtas. I'm not going to sing you the whole song, but all of you know the niggin, and I'm telling you that when he finished Shas, and he knows Shas, you could ask him any place, and one of the first things that he said at that siyum, which he made in my house, he said, you know why I was able to learn Shas? Because I wasn't afraid of it. Because as a child, I knew the names of all the Masechtas. Now, I can tell you that year, when he was in the 5th grade, my daughter was in seminary. And we were going to Eretz Yisrael for Sukkot because she was in seminary. Now, of course, by the time I got to Eretz Yisrael on the plane, I was sitting next to Eliezer, he already knew Zroim and Maggid. And in 5 minutes, you're going to know Zroim in a second. You'll see in a second. And what I would say is that if you could make up a song or even use this song, you'll see, you'll learn all the names of the Masechtas, and all your children and grandchildren will name it. I have a great-grandchild, I think he's 3, and he knows it. He can't say it clearly, he doesn't speak so clearly, but he knows the tune, and he knows many of the Masechtas. So my daughter was in seminary at that time. And I think the first week after Sukkot, Rebbetzin David happened to ask, does anybody know what Tamura is? And she said, yeah, it's one of the Mishnayos in Kachim. And Rebbetzin David almost fainted. How could this girl know that Tamura? Well, because she knew the song. So I'm just going to sing you the first part of the song, and you'll see how easy it is. Brachas and pei, admai and klayim, shviyis and trumos and maiserois, Ma'aser sheni chala ola bikurim ze seides roim. If I sang that 5 times, then everybody would know it, right? All you got to do, take any song that you want. Avram Fried, Mordechai ben David, whatever song you want. And just name the Masechtas, teach it to your kids. You sing it in the car. Put it on a well, there's no CDs anymore, but whatever, MP3s, however you're going to do it. And you'll see, you'll become familiar with it. And that's what the Stipler did to his son, Reb Chaim. So as a 3-year-old, he knew all the Masechtas. And that's how he began getting his great Aava Satora. Now, at recess, what did he do? He didn't play punchball like me and the Woolikas did in Tarvadas, right? Oh, you didn't play punchball, I did. But anyway, or basketball or whatever. He used to count how many times Abaya was in the Masechtas. He loved Svarim. Now, I'm going to tell you something, you won't believe this. It's amazing. Many of us, certainly here, have been to Reb Chaim's house. Did you ever notice? He never, ever sat with his back to a sefer. Ever. Behind him, either was a window or a wall. He had over thousands of svarim. I was in the room numerous times. Never would he sit with his back to a sefer. The svarim were here or here. The Kavod Torah was so incredible. I'm not telling you that you can do that. Not everybody can do that, obviously. But that's what his love of Torah was. If he saw a sefer upside down, he would turn it over right away. If a sefer was dusty, he would clean it. He had a total love of Torah. Now, when he was a little boy, when he was 4 years old, he moved from Europe, he came to Eretz Yisrael. I'm just going to tell you his birthday, because I hope somebody here has his birthday. I'll tell you his English and Hebrew birthday, and if you have that birthday, you could feel so lucky. He was born January 8th, 1928. Anybody here born January 8th? Well, maybe somebody who's watching. And Tezvav Teves. Anybody Tezvav Teves? What? Oh, your son's birthday. Okay, maybe he'll be a gadol. You never know. It's never too late. But anyway, but the idea is, when he was 4 years old, he came to Eretz Yisrael. Now, his mother's brother, you know who his mother's brother was? The Chazon Ish. Now, tragically, the Chazon Ish had no children. And so when this 4-year-old genius came to his house, the Chazon Ish loved him like a child. And you could understand how much time he spent learning with him and talking with this little genius. Now, I want to show you something, how an Adam Gadol thinks. We're going to talk in a few minutes how Rab Chaim looked at things. And we know that Chazal tell us that Talmidei Chachamim are the Einei Ha'eda. What does that mean, the Einei Ha'eda? They are the eyes of the community. They see certain things that we see, but they see them in a different way. So watch this, how the Chazon Ish looked at something. When he first came to Eretz Yisrael from Europe, he came to Bnei Brak. It was all farm town. It was all farms, right? There was no streets. But he lived in a house, and it was very dark. So they went to the municipality, and they said, you know, this is the Gadol Adar that lives here. You got to make a street light in front of his house. Chas v'sholom, he could fall at night. It's not safe. So they built a light, and they put in a street light right next to the Chazon Ish's house. A few nights later, after the light was up, somebody came over to the Chazon Ish and said, Rebbe, no, what do you say about the light? So he said something so interesting. He said, I noticed something amazing. When I'm down the block and I'm walking towards the light, my shadow is very, very big. But as I get closer and closer to the light, my shadow gets small. When I'm standing next to the light, I have no shadow at all. And he says, you know what that's a remez to? Listen how the Chazon Ish thinks. When you're far away from Torah, the Or HaTorah, you think, oh, I know so much. I've got such a big shadow. I cover so much ground. But the closer and closer you get to that light of Torah, you realize how little you really know. Imagine that. That's how the Chazon Ish looked at a street light. Next time you look at a street light, think about that. But you could be sure that he told it to his nephew, Chaim, who was 4 or 5 and growing up in his house. That just remember, the more you learn, the more you're going to realize that you don't know. And that's why you could never, ever stop learning. So that was part of the Aava Satora. Now I'll tell you something amazing. We know one of the greatest Yidden that we have today in Klal Yisrael is Rab David Hafstadter Shlita. Rab David is the most wonderful person who has started Dirshu and accomplished tremendous all over the world. So he wrote that after Rab Chaim was niftar, that he once asked Rab Chaim for a bracha for Zichron HaTorah, to remember Torah. He wanted his schooler to remember. So Rab Chaim told him 2 things. He said, it's not a question of a schooler. The first thing is you got a chazer. You have to review over and over and over and over. There's no shortcuts when it comes to remembering Torah. You have to chazer. That's the first thing. And the second thing is, he said, it really has to be important to you. Something that is important to you, like lahavdil, your wife's birthday, you're going to remember it, or else, right? So something that really means something to you, you're going to remember. So if it's important, you're going to remember it. So Torah has to be important. But when I heard what he said about Chazorah, if you have a pencil and paper, I want you to write this down, because you're going to see something now that is absolutely incredible. And every time we go to Prague, and we've been to Europe, right? Many great places. We were in Ukraine together, of course. What? 5 years. That's right. Oh my gosh. You're right, that's true. So, you're right, 2017. So, when I go to Prague, I always say this word outside the Prague shul, because not only was the Maral Prague the Rav there, the Klayokar was a Rav there. And listen to this genius vort from the Klayokar. And he says like this. We all know the Gemara in Chagiga Daf Tesam and Beis that Eina doime shayne pirkei meya pa'amim l'shayne pirkei meya ve'echad. There's no comparison to somebody who learned something 100 times to 101 times. Thank you so much. Thank you. Good. No sugar. So the Klayokar asks, why does the Gemara say 100 and 101? What's wrong with 99 and 100, or 85 and 86, or 108, 109? What's up to 101? Why did the Gemara pick out 101? Watch this. It's unbelievable. He says like this: every time you learn something, you're bound to forget it. Because your mind, can't remember everything. But if you learn it a second time, you weaken the koyach of shikha. If you learn it a third time, you weaken the koyach of shikha again. You learn it a fourth time, every time you weaken the koyach of shikha. Now watch this. If you could write down the word shokach, please write it down. Shin Kov Ches. How much is, Rabbi Metzger, how much is Shin Kov Ches b'gematria? 328, right? Now, what if you learn something 101 times? How much is 328 minus 101? 227. The word Zohar, remember, is 227. That's why it's 101 times. Could you imagine that? Because Shokach, if you learn something, you're going to forget it. But every time you learn it, it's then you're going to remember it better. But if you really want to remember it, you learn it 101 times. It goes from Shokach to Zohar, a genius word from the Klayakar. Now, I want to show you now the greatest word that I ever heard from Rab Chaim. Absolutely the greatest. And we are going to see something that is so incredible, and that's why the Chazal called the Talmud Chachamim the Einei Yoeda, because you and I, what I'm going to show you now, we've seen it 1,000 times. We all know the story, but where in the world did he get this from? Now, we all know the story that Yitzchak wanted to give Esav the brachas, right? What happened? Yaakov comes in and he gets the bracha. After V'yiten L'cha, you could look it up in Parshas Toldos. If you have a chumash in front of you, take it out because you won't believe what I'm about to show you. In Bereshis Chav Zayin Lamed Aleph. Chav Zayin Lamed Aleph. And it tells us now that Esav comes into the house and he brings food to his father Yitzchak. And the pasuk says like this: Vayovei la'aviv. Vayovei la'aviv. He brought it to his father. Take a look at these words. Anybody notice something interesting about these words? Mr. Khan, what do you say? What's interesting about these words? It's a palindrome, right? You can read it frontwards and backwards. Whoever thought about that? Mr. Lackman, right? You ever think about that? It's a palindrome. You can read it. Mom, Pop, David, Yishai, Aviva, race car. Zok. So first of all, that I even noticed that it's a palindrome was amazing, right? That's what Rab Chaim did. But listen to the lesson that he said. The way you treat your parents, that's how your children are going to treat you. Isn't that amazing? That's why it says Vayove la'oviv. It's a palindrome. The way you treat your parents, that's how your children are going to treat you. Now, that's what Rab Chaim darshaned. Let me show you the lamaisa. I had the great zchus to visit with his son-in-law. His son-in-law is Rabbi Yitzchak Kanievsky. Rabbi Yitzchak Kanievsky wrote a sefer, 2 volumes. He wrote a sefer called L'Shichnoi Siddushu. It's stories about tzaddikim. And of course, everybody knows I love stories, especially about tzaddikim. So I went to visit him, and we were talking, and he said to me like this. He said, I want you to know that my father-in-law, Rab Chaim, every single morning, after davening, he'd go in to visit his mother. Every morning. Sometimes she would make a little breakfast for him, they would shmooze or whatever. He was there for a few minutes, and then he went to kollel. Every single morning. When she passed away, he stopped coming. After the Shiva, he was walking in the street, and he met his father, the stipler. So the stipler sees his son, Rab Chaim, and he says to him in Yiddish, I'll say it in Yiddish because it's so chaviv to me, and then I'll translate. He said, Ich pflege echt op en anov in the flex kommen. I also used to enjoy when you came. And Rab Chaim's mouth dropped open. He couldn't believe it. You know, mother likes to schmooze. What, a father? The Gadol Hador wants to schmooze? Okay, even if he's going to schmooze and learn it, what, he's interested in social life. You know, he wants to also sit and learn. No. Vayove la'aviv. Rab Chaim understood. A Tate will haben Ashachas mit a Kind. A father wants to have a connection to a child. And you know what Rabbi Yitzchak Kanievsky told me? From the day that the stipler told that to Rab Chaim, the next morning he came to visit him, and he didn't miss the next 12 years until the stipler was niftar. He understood what it meant for his father. Vayavi la'aviv, and he went to visit him. Now listen to this. Unfortunately, Rab Chaim had a sister, Rebbetzin Yosfa Barzam. She was an almana at a very young age. And when her mother passed away, she moved in with her father, the stipler. So every morning when Rab Chaim went to visit the stipler, he would see his sister. She lived there. And even after Rab Chaim, the stipler was nifter, he still went to visit his sister for years afterwards. They were very, very tight with family. Very close with family. With all their children, grandchildren, and great-grandchildren. Family was very important to Rab Chaim and to his Rebbetzin. I want to show you a different thing about a story that I heard from people that were there when it happened. There was a fellow, a wealthy guy who lived in Bnei Brak, who would come every day, right in the middle of lunch in Panovich, and he would learn with his son, after the kid had lunch, they would learn for an hour or two in the Panovich yeshiva. He was able to get away from his business, and he would learn every day with his son. One day, he comes in every day, and he sees there's a whole tumult. And people are avoiding him, like he knows something is wrong. You know, you get that feeling. And he goes over, he says, "Where's my son? I don't see my son. Is everybody okay?" And they said, "Your son was just taken to the hospital. He was hit by a bus." He says, "What are you talking about?" He said, "It just happened a few minutes ago. Hatzolah came, and they rushed him to the hospital. We didn't know where to reach you." This was before cell phones. And of course, the guy ran to the hospital, and he found out that the kid was crossing a street, and a bus hit him, and mamash a ness. It was a very, very high bus, and he was just flat on the ground, so he was injured, but the doctors told him that he's going to make it. He was in the emergency room, and he was there with his son, and of course he stayed overnight, and the doctor said, the way he was hit, you're so lucky that he's alive, because if it would have been a little bit different on a different angle, chas v'shalom. So now, he was so grateful. So a day or two later, when he was with his son, and he couldn't leave his son, he sent somebody to Rabbi Chaim Kanievsky. And he said, "Look, I want to do something for HaKadosh Baruch Hu. I'm so grateful that my son's life was saved. What could I do?" Listen to what Rabbi Chaim said. Rabbi Chaim said, the Eibishter gave you life. What is life by us? Torah. Kehem chayenu v'oirach yameinu. V'chayei olam nota b'sachenu. He said, what you have to do is, Hashem gave you life. You have to give life to another person. You know how you give life? Every yeshiva has boys that are falling by the wayside. They can't keep up with the shiur, so they need a private tutor. You should hire a tutor for one of the boys in Panovich that needs some chizuk and learning, so that he'll be able to keep up with the shiur. And when the guy heard this, in the name of Rav Chaim, he almost collapsed. You know why? Because last week, the week before the accident, somebody asked him to pay for a tutor for somebody in the yeshiva. And this guy was a wealthy guy, so he said, of course, I'll do it. And that day of the accident, the first check was due. Imagine that. That day of the accident, Rabbi Burl was the one who told me the story. He was there in Panovich when it happened. Because he paid for that tutor. And he gave that kid Chaim. That's exactly what Rabbi Chaim was saying. He got life, he should give life, and he gave life. And that's what happened. Now I'll tell you a diuk that Rabbi Chaim said that was absolutely fabulous. Rabbi Chaim said, the Pasuk tells us in Kedoshim, Vayikor Yutes Beis, Kedoshim to you, Ki Kadosh Ani Hashem Elokeichem. You should all be holy because I'm holy. Ki Kadosh Ani Hashem Elokeichem. So Rab Chaim noticed, when it says Kedoshim to you, there's a chaser. It's missing a vav. But when it says Ki Kadosh Ani Hashem Elokeichem, there is a vav. So Rab Chaim asked, it's the same pasuk. Vayikor Yutes pasuk beis. Why by Hashem it says Kedoshim? By us it says Kedoshim. We should be Kadosh, but it's chaser. But by Hashem Ki Kadosh, it's a vav. He said it's obvious because Hashem could be totally kedusha. So there's no letter missing. Ki kadosh kuv dalet vav shin. But we'll never be totally kedusha. So therefore the vav is missing. What a great diuk. It sounds like, Rab Zera would say it. Or like Rashi would say it. What a diuk. It's unbelievable how Rab Chaim thought. Now, the last 37 years of his life, people came nonstop. And of course, many of us certainly were there. I was certainly there a few times. I asked him a few shilas and bris milah and other things. And but he never looked at it as a bother. Now, of course, we all saw that he had his index card, and he would look down, on the Gemara, and he was going down, and that if he noticed somebody was there, he would look up, answer the shaila, and he would go right back to his learning. And he never looked at seeing people as a bother. And somebody once asked him, why do you do that? Learning is more than anything else in your life. Why would you spend so much time seeing people? And you know what he said? One never knows in what schus he is alive. Reb Chaim said, maybe I'm alive only in the schus that I help people. We're all very busy, especially in New York, right? It's a very, very hectic type of life. And many times we don't have time for other people. And we rationalize, because we're busy doing good things. But something? Reb Chaim was doing better things than we would ever do. His learning was holding up the world. But yet, he said, maybe I'm alive only in the schus of helping people. And that's what I mean, that we have to be doila or mashka. We have to learn from him. We have to learn to care for other people. There's no question that we're busy, and there's no question that he was the greatest masmid, but somehow he had time for everybody. And that's something that we have to learn from him. Now, Rav Pam once said that many, many people make a mistake when it comes to talking about Kiddush Shem Shemayim. Many people, if you would ask them, what's a Kiddush Shem Shemayim? You say, well, if a guy sees that a Yid does something good, so they say, whoa, this is a great nation. These are good people. That's true. That is a Kiddush Hashem, but that's not the Ikka Kiddush Hashem. The main Kiddush Hashem is that other Yidden should be impressed with you. That other Yidden should say, I want to daven like that man. I want to daven like his kids daven next to him. I want my kids to daven next to me. The way he learns, the way he davens, the way he treats his wife, the way he does chesed, the way he's involved in a shul. That's what I want to be like. And that's what Rav Pam writes. Why? Because it says, V'lo yischalalu Hashem kodesh v'nigdashti b'soich b'nei Yisrael. That's the Ikka Kiddush Hashem. Vayikar Chav Beis, Lamed Beis. And now I want to read you a Ksav Sefer on that pasuk. That pasuk that Rav Pam is telling us. Just remember the Ikka Kiddush Shem Shemayim is to inspire other Yidden. V'chein derech hatzadikim. This is how tzadikim are. Listen to the Ksav Sefer. She'einam is them. They don't just go off in a corner and learn by themselves and keep away from everybody. Ki im me'uravim bein habriyos. They're involved with people. Ubalibam devukim Hashem u'b'tarosai. And in their heart, of course, they are connected to Hashem. Ve'im lo yasakein. If somebody just goes off in the corner and he's learning himself and he's got nothing to do with anybody else, mechalel Hashem. That's a chilul Hashem. You think you're learning and you're having nothing to do with anybody? You think you're a big tzaddik? You're not. It's a chilul Hashem. She'oimrim, because then people will say, because he knows how to learn, he can't have anything to do with other people. There's no greater chilul Hashem. You got to be involved. There's time for everything. And you'll find the time to learn. But if somebody needs you, you got to be there. You can't just be locking yourself up on a corner. That's not what Reb Chaim did. For the last 37 years of his life, he saw everybody. Now, at night before he went to sleep, he had a great memory, obviously. He would say Tillim for all the people that came to him that day. Could you imagine that? All the finster tzaras that people would talk to him about. He had a memory, and his children would say that he would daven, he would say till, and then by the next morning he forgot who they were. He had selective memory. He remembered all the tzaras for that day. At night he would daven, and then the next morning he couldn't even remember them. And many times his children said that Reb Chaim would say to people, you got to daven. So the children said, did they daven every day? No, you got to daven extra. You have to have a Seder and Tillim. If a person has tzaras, it's not enough just to daven the regular Shemoneh Esrei. You have to daven more. Have a Seder and Tillim and daven extra. That's what Reb Chaim was saying. Now, it's very interesting. He never, ever refused to be Sandik. It says in Mefarshim, it says in Svarim, that Sandik, if you're a Sandik, it's a school of Fashiras. So in Bnei Brak, could you imagine? I mean, I can't imagine it happening any place else. But in Bnei Brak, there were times when he was a sandik 10 times a day. 10 times a day. Now, only once in my life did I have a bris where he was sandik. I'm very close to the Graineman family, and the Kanievskys are related to the Grainemans. And a friend of mine had a baby, and he knew I was coming to Eretz Yisrael, and he said to me, if you get off the plane and you come straight to Bnei Brak, you'll be able to do the bris. We'll have Rab Chaim there, and you'll be able to do the bris. Now, of course, I should have hired a photographer, but I didn't, and I regret it till this day. But I will tell you this, when you're a mile, you've got to hold the sandik's hands, because you got to adjust them, that he should hold the baby correctly. Just to touch his hands, his fluffy hands, and just to move his hands around the baby's legs. It was such a thrill. It was a tremendous covenant, and I'm so grateful that I was able to do it even once. But I want to tell you a great story about this. You see, one day there was a couple in Eretz Yisrael in Bnei Brak who didn't have children for many, many years. And they found out that Rab Chaim was going to be a sandik in a place called Kiryat Shmona. And Kiryat Shmona is 3 hours away from Bnei Brak. So this couple who had no children, they went to Rab Chaim and they said, when you come back from Kiryat Shmona, would you mind having your driver take you to a city called Shunam? Now Shunam is an Arab city, but Shunam, the Isha HaShunamis, is buried there. And it's written in Svarim that Elisha, who had given the Isha HaShunamis a bracha and she had a child, that those who daven in Shunam, it's a school for children. So this couple who didn't have children said, we'll meet you there. We won't go to the bris, we'll go up to Shunam, but when you come back down from Kiryat Shmona, do you mind diverting the driver to come to Shunam, and we could all daven together so my wife and I should be able to have children? Rab Chaim thinks about it, he says, okay, I'll meet you there. Fine. Kiryat Shmona, he's sandik by the bris, and he has the driver take him to Shunam. He gets out of the car, there are 2 busloads of couples who don't have children. 2 busloads. Rab Chaim walks out of the car and he looks around and he says to this guy, what in the world is going on here? He didn't use that expression, but that's what he meant, right? Like, what's going on here? Like, how did this happen? I thought I was just meeting you. He said, Rebbe, please excuse me. I must have told a few people, and word got out, and everybody in Bnei Brak who doesn't have children, they all got on the buses. And we got 2 buses of people here, some 5 years, 10 years, 6 years, whatever. And they want to daven together with the Rav and his Rebbetzin. So Rab Chaim made 2 rows, the women on this side, the men on this side. He said, we'll all daven together. And then after about 15 minutes, he said everybody should step back, and him and his Rebbetzin were going to daven alone. Now, I have a niece, her name is Chanala Dollinger. She works in the Maine HaYeshua hospital in the obstetric department in Maine HaYeshua. And she told me, it's unbelievable, that 9 and 10 and 11 months after this incident, there was so many older couples who never had children that were having children one after the other. She told me she had a neighbor that didn't have children for 6 or 7 years. She had a child. She's got 8 kids today, this woman. And she told my niece, Chanala Dollinger, that she went to Rab Chaim to say thank you. Now, I know my Rebbe, Rab David Cohen, and many, many others say that some Rabbanim feel bad that you come for a bracha, and then when things happen, you don't come to say thank you. So this lady, the neighbor of my niece, went to Rab Chaim to say thank you. You know what he told her? You're the 13th couple from those 2 buses that have kids. 13 couples! Could you imagine? That was the koyach hatfila that Rab Chaim had, because he cared. And that's how the Eibishter listened to him. Now, this is absolutely incredible. In autumn of 2001, Rab Chaim had a stroke, Rachmana litzlan, and he was paralyzed. He couldn't move his hands, he couldn't move his fingers, and the therapist, also happened to be in Maine HaYeshua, was working with him. You're not going to believe this. Now, he was working with him, trying to get his fingers to start moving again, and he was doing therapy, and then he realized that now Rab Chaim could start writing again. Slowly, but he would be able to move his fingers. So he told Rab Chaim, which he told every single patient of his, please write something. Gave him a piece of paper, and Rab Chaim wrote, Yukum Purkon Min Shemaya. That's what he wrote. Yukum Purkon Min Shemaya means salvation should come from heaven. So the therapist said, Rebbe, you got to explain something to me. I've been doing this 30 years. Every single person, without fail, when you ask them to write something after they haven't written in a while after a stroke, what's the first thing you think they write? What would you write? Your name, right? They would sign their name. He says, Rebbe, why didn't you sign your name? Everybody signs their name. He says, Refresh a Gemara. He says, a Gemara? He says, yeah. The Gemara in Ksubas Chaf Aleph says you're not allowed to sign your name on an empty piece of paper. Because the guy could write on top of it, I owe you $20,000. And you signed it. Imagine that. So after a stroke, that's the first thing he's thinking about. That Gemara, that din in Shulchan Aruch, that you can't write your name on an empty piece of paper. That's amazing. That's how Reb Chaim was thinking. Now here's the best story. My favorite story about Reb Chaim. We'll see the Pneim Ishaloch. It's unbelievable. This was many years ago when he was still able to walk easily, and it was the month of Tishrei. And he went with his son-in-law to buy a lulav. So he comes into a store in Bnei Brak, and the guy who's selling lulav, Reb Chaim, he gives him a beautiful lulav. Reb Chaim looks at it, no, not this one. So he says, okay, second one, no, not the second one. The third one, yeah, this one will take, and he pays for it, and he leaves the store with his son-in-law. A guy comes running out of the store, and he says to the son-in-law, I don't believe what I just saw. He said, what do you mean? He says, you know how long it takes me to get a lulav? An hour and a half. Your father-in-law was in the store 15 minutes, and he got a lulav. Hashem must love him. How did that happen? He says, come with me. The guy takes him with Reb Chaim and the son-in-law. They come to Rehov Rashbam. They walk up the stairs to the house. They come to the table where Reb Chaim learns. There are 25 lulavim on the table. He says, what is this? Listen to what he said. He said, Reb Chaim knows that everybody watches every single thing that he does. And he knows that if he walks into a store to buy a lulav and he doesn't buy a lulav there, no one is going to buy a lulav there anymore. Why? Because they're going to say, Reb Chaim went in to buy a lulav and he couldn't find one. I'm going to find one. So every store he goes into, he buys at least one lulav. Imagine that. Every store he went into, he bought at least one lulav. When he's got 25, now it takes him 3 hours to pick out the right one. Who thinks about that? If somebody goes in to buy a suit, or a woman goes in to buy a dress, and they don't have what you want, it's their problem. It's not your problem. No, to Reb Chaim, it's his problem. Because people might not buy from that proprietor, from that guy who owns the lulavim and the sroigim, and they're not going to buy. That's the sensitivity of Reb Chaim. Now we know, there's a video, you could see it, of how he would say, how his wife said the brachas for him every morning. They were very, very close. He never ate without her. She never ate without him. So he's sitting by his shtender. She's standing on this side. She's saying the brachas. And you could hear after every bracha, he says amen. But what was fascinating to me, she didn't say Shelo Yasani Oved. She said Shelo Yasani Shivcha. And he didn't correct her, obviously, that he felt that was okay. And some people told me that in the Svarish Sidurim, the women also, they don't say Shelo Yasani Oved, they say Shelo Yasani Shivcha. Now, Nebuch, she was nifter on a Shabbos. She was nifter on Sukkos, Cholamoid Sukkos. And of course, you can't make a levaya on Shabbos. So everybody was sitting around the house. And all the children, the grandchildren, and the great-grandchildren, they all came in to talk to the Zayda. And so everybody was sitting around. And one of the grandchildren asked this question. Zayda, what would you say was the best midah of the Baba? And that's a great question to see how Reb Chaim touched up his wife. So there were people there that were positive that he was going to say Shmir Saloshen. That was the greatest midah. Why? Because every girl that came in for a shidduch, she would always say that they should learn 2 halachas a day of Shmir Saloshen, but that's not what he said. He didn't say that was her greatest midah. Some people thought that he would say her tznius. Now we all know, of course, that she was very makbid in tznius, and that she would talk to everybody about that as well. And so therefore, they thought that, but that's not what he said. The third thing was Avas Yisrael. They thought he would say about her Avos Yisrael. That's not what she said. That's not what he said about his Rebbetzin. He said, you know what the greatest midah that she had? Savlonis. Savlonis means patience. He said, do you know how many women would come to her every day? And not all of them were 100%. We know that. And they would cry to her, and she would daven with them, and she would cry with them, and she had patience for them. And that's the midah that we have to learn. Patience. Patience, even with those people that are not exactly like we are. And you know, we all have patience for our friends and close family members, but there's a lot of people that get on our nerves. And, you know, it's normal, right? Either at home or in the workplace. But that was the midah that Rab Chaim spoke about his wife, having patience, savlonas. And I'll tell you an amazing thing. Do you know, there's a tremendous Talmud Chacham in Borough Park. His name is Rab Shmuel David Friedman. He was very, very close to Rab Chaim. He was there many, many times. He gave numerous hespedim on Rab Chaim. He's written many, many, many svarim. He figured out that since Sheishis Yemei Bereshis, there was no gadol ever that wrote as many letters as Rab Chaim did. He's positive. Now, of course, Rab Chaim's letters were one word. Efsher, Mutter, Osir, many, many times. Only one word. My own son Avram from Waterbury has 15 letters for Rab Chaim, and in those 15 letters, there are shilas that are answered 50 different shilas. You had to keep a cheshbon, 1, 2, 3, 4, and then you would write it, and then send him that piece of paper, and he would answer each shilah, mutter, osir, or whatever it was. But somebody once asked him, why do you answer all these letters? Listen to what Rab Chaim said. He said, I'm not a Rosh Hashiva. I don't have any Talmidim. Where am I going to get Talmidim? So when I write the letters, and these people follow my psak, they become my Talmidim. That's why I have Talmidim. Now I'll tell you an amazing thing. Do you know that he would have somebody open the letters for him and give them to him in a certain order? Now, you know which letters he answered first? If somebody wrote that they were a Kohen, they got first answer. The ones who got the second answer were the Leviim. And you know who got the third answer? You wouldn't believe. Anybody whose name was Yaakov Yisrael. He felt I was keeping after his father. Because his father, the stipler, was called Yaakov Yisrael, and so therefore Mamela, that's what he did. Now, I remember that I asked him this shaila, and again, I'm not saying anybody should paskin this. Again, you know, he paskined it for me, and, you know, in the situation that I asked him, and I'll tell it to you in a second, but it does happen, and if it does happen in your family, or you know anybody, of course, you have to ask your Rav that usually paskins for you. But it happens numerous times that a baby is born and he can't have a bris for whatever reason. Either he's not well or there's other problems. But now the bris is going to be delayed for 2 or 3 weeks. So what do? Can you give the child a name? Or should you give the child a name? So Rabbi Kanievsky told me personally that don't give a name. Don't give a name. That's what Rabbi Kanievsky told me. And I asked the Rosh Hashiva why. So again, only Gedolim think this way. He said, once you give a child a name, it's no longer a pressing issue for the baby to have a bris, because he's got a name. So what's going to happen is, they're not going to push the doctor right away, you know, let's do the bris at the earliest time, because the kid's got a name already. So don't give a name, and that'll be a pressure. That's what Rabbi Yaakov told me, that don't give a name, and so they'll have the bris as soon as possible. Rab Chaim told me that you don't give a name yet, but you could call him whatever you want, but you could change it by the time that you have the bris. So if, let's say, you called him Yossi for whatever reason, because you didn't want him to go without a name, and you don't want to call him Yingala for 6 months, but at the bris, you still have the opportunity to change it, because it only becomes official by V'yikora Shemar B'Yisrael. He did not say that you should have an aliyah and give the baby a name. Hold off giving a name, wait till the bris, you could call him whatever you want, and then at the bris, that's when it becomes official. Now, the stipler, his father, also never refused to be sandik. So somebody once went to the stipler and said, you were astounded by so many brisin. And it's a school of Ashiras. Where's your Ashiras? So the disciple said, "My Chaimul." That's the Ashiras. And that's the final lesson. There's nothing greater than our children. There's nothing greater investment in our time and our effort than our children. And that's what we have to learn from Reb Chaim. Reb Chaim and his Rebbetzin were very, very close to their children. If he had a Seder with any of his children and grandchildren and somebody wanted to make a Seder with him at that time, he wouldn't do it because the children and the family came first. That was the Vayove La'aviv. And that's what we have to learn tonight. There's no question that the Iker Bar Reb Chaim was certainly the learning. The Shas that he finished, Bavli, Yerushalmi, Medrash, Shulchan Aruch, Chachmei, the Kisvei Rizal, Kisvei Ramchal, everything. But Parsek and Ofayim Lamaila, but we can never forget the Pnei Mishal Ochiv. The Eibusher should help in the schus of the Heilig Tzaddik, that all of us should undertake some of the midas that we heard about, so it should be a schus for his neshama and a schus for all of us. Thank you.
Shem Irgen Shir Torah Moses Boston. I'd like to give a big shekach to Rabbi Krohn for the very inspiring drasha. I'd like to give a big shekach to the exclusive sponsor of tonight's shir. Be'elam Shem Lili Nishmas the cover the Shloishim Lili Nishmas Rabbi Yeshua ben Rabbi Yitzchak Rabbi Shalom, sponsored by his daughter. Then Nishmas Tzur B'Tzar Chaim. Have the great exclusive sponsoring a shir call Irgen Shir Torah at 718-851-8651. Email ist@yeshivanet.com. Scheduled next week's shirim are on some of the tables throughout the Beis Medrash. Please take the opportunity to be mishtatef in the big hitzos of Irgen Shir Torah summer program by making use of one of the pushka trays that are throughout the shul. Now, shekar to everyone for coming. Ma'ariv at 10 o'clock. Chananya ben Akashem, Arutzak Kadosh Baruch Hu, the Zakes is Yisrael. Fik Chibadam Torah Mitzvah Shenema, Adonai Chofes, Aman Tzidke, Yagdol Torah V'Yadeh. Nein.